Chapter 4. Tibet had not been forgotten by Sundar Singh. The Himalayan peaks, silent and still in the distance beyond Sadhu, constantly beckoned him. Tibetan traders with their inscrutable eastern features, their prayer wheels, and their long-haired yaks, mingled with the native population in the border towns and villages northeast of Simla. They were a constant reminder of that enclosed and forbidding land. The Hindustan-Tibet road climbed high above the river Sutlej. As Sundar began his first journey to Tibet along that road, he could see the river far below, winding like a silver thread through the trees. The road swept down into the sultry valley past the town of Rampur. This was not the Rampur where Sundar was born, but a trading post where even the architecture spoke of Tibet. Out of Rampur, the road degenerated into a track. Clinging to the steep mountainsides, it made its way up and up, higher and higher. The temperature dropped sharply. It was lonely. Sundar Singh had reached Lesser Tibet. The Moravian Church had already penetrated this far, and when Sundar reached their mission station at Poo, he was welcomed by the two missionaries there, Kunik and Marx, who pressed Sundar to stay briefly with them. They were able to teach him the rudiments of the Tibetan language. Sundar's plans caught their imagination, and anxious to encourage him, they promised that a young Christian layman from the mission, Tarnyed Ali, should accompany him. Sundar accepted gladly. He was already beginning to sense the alien nature of the country, and a companion and guide who knew the language would be a comfort and an asset. The two young men set off up the mountain track, deeper and deeper into Tibet. All that he saw filled Sundar with despair and shock. The people were dirty, superstitious, and ignorant. Their food was poor, their homes evil-smelling as their owners. At Kiwar village, Sundar and Tarnyed Ali were driven out because its inhabitants were so disgusted to see them washing themselves in their clothes in a stream. A local lama who witnessed this spectacle told the people, "It is all right for sinful men to wash their clothes, but for good people to do so is very bad." Later, Sundar was to record how in one place, Laura, he saw a man who was quite black from dirt, and who obviously could not have had a bath for a decade. "The people's clothes," he wrote, "although made of white wool, from filth look as if they were made of black leather because they never washed them." Food was an even worse problem. The mainstay of their diet was dried barley, which is so hard and indigestible that even animals have been known to refuse it. For drink, there was Tibetan tea, which is mixed with salt and rancid butter. Everywhere the prayer wheels turned, bearing the mystic words, Om Mane Padme Hum. Impossible to translate literally, since each syllable denotes a whole range of meaning, and the meaning of the whole is greater than the meaning of its component parts. It was hardly fertile ground for a Christian preacher. The points of contact were so few. On this first visit, although their reception in the village was decidedly cool, they were never physically ill-treated. Sundar and Tarnyed, however, were left in no doubt that the preaching of Christianity would not be tolerated in this Buddhist stronghold. The lamas were strongly entrenched and their authority absolute. Since the peasants lived in fear of them, there was little chance for any stranger to gain a hearing. The important center of Tashigang boasted a chief lama, a man with jurisdiction over numerous subordinate priests. Here, expecting the usual enmity, Sundar and his companion were surprised by a warm welcome. Evidently, the chief lama of Tashigang must have been a man of liberal sympathies. They were given food and shelter and invited to speak to the people. Only very occasionally did they meet such friendliness. Once they were threatened with the words, "If you do not stop troubling us, the same treatment will be given to you as was meted out to Kartar Singh." Sundar was to hear the name Kartar Singh again and again, but it was not until they met a Tibetan convert to Christianity that they learned the whole story of Kartar's witness and martyrdom. It transpired that Kartar Singh's early history was remarkably similar to Sundar's. Both came from the same Sikh country. Both had been turned out of their homes by their fathers. Both had refused to renounce their Christian faith. Kartar Singh, on finding himself without home, clothes, or money, had worked as a laborer until he could buy for himself the yellow robe of a Sadhu. Tibet called to him, as it was later to call to Sundar Singh, and for 3 months he preached there about Jesus. The people, egged on by the lamas, grew more and more aggressive. He was brought before the head lama of the area and charged with teaching a foreign religion. Since their Buddhist religion forbids the taking of life, the Tibetans had devised their own sadistic punishments, which inevitably ended in the death of the victim, but relieved the instigators of direct responsibility. So it was that Kartar Singh was sentenced to be sewn into a wet yak skin, which was to be left in the sun to dry and shrink, thus squeezing the prisoner to death. This Kartar Singh endured, praying and singing all the while. On the 4th day, knowing death was near, he asked to have his right hand freed, so that he could write. In the flyleaf of his New Testament which lay beside him, he wrote a verse praising God. With his last ounce of strength he spoke to the people. Are you standing by to see the death of a Christian? Come and gaze attentively, that not a Christian but death itself dies here. O Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit, because it is thine." Those were to be his last words on earth. One of those who had observed his martyrdom was the Lama's personal secretary. He picked up the dead man's New Testament and took it home. He turned its pages curiously. What was Kartar Singh's inspiration that he died so bravely? As the secretary read, he became more and more impressed and soon began to tell others of what he had found. The Lama was angry. Kartar Singh's punishment was to have deterred people from taking Christianity seriously, and here was one of his own men actually converted to these pernicious beliefs by witnessing this Christian's death. The secretary could expect no mercy and did not receive it. He was cruelly beaten and his wounded body was left for dead on a rubbish dump outside the town. But he did not die. Strength came to crawl away, and slowly his wounds healed. Courageously he went back to the town, and the people cowered away from him, for they were deeply fearful of the power that had given life to one they thought was dead. From that time onwards he was left alone and allowed to preach unmolested. It was he who told Sundar of Kartar Singh's death. The story of these two brave men moved Sundar greatly. Often he was to tell their tale. On Patiala railway station, while speaking to a group after his return from Tibet, he noticed a man with tears running down his face standing on the fringe of the crowd. It was Kartar Singh's father, who had turned his son out of his home, and who had had no news of him since that day. Sundar Singh's story of his son's brave death, and indeed Sundar himself, so like his son in so many ways, had a profound effect on the old man, who himself was to become a Christian. Their first tour of Tibet was nearly ended. Sundar and Tarnyet Ali made their way home. Soon the snow would block the mountain passes and travel would be impossible. Sundar now knew for certain that God was calling him to further work in Tibet. Until his disappearance 20 years later in that same treacherous land, he was to make many such journeys. The melting of the snows in the spring and early summer were a yearly signal to make ready for another visit. It was 2 years since Sundar's baptism, 2 years that had matured him. He had proved himself in his God-given vocation. His body had become hardened against the discomforts he daily faced. In discomfort, in danger, in speaking of his faith, in exhaustion, in suffering, hostility, he had felt God's presence and known his guidance. Shy and reserved though he was, he had a serene confidence, the mark of an inner strength. It impressed others, among them Sushil Rudra and Charles F. Andrews, whose acquaintance Sundar made shortly after his first visit to Tibet. Sushil Rudra, an Indian, was the principal of St. Stephen's College, Delhi. This was a Christian institution providing university education for boys from the Punjab. The Reverend Charles Andrews, an English missionary, was on the staff of the college and a great friend of Rudra's, with whom he lodged. At the beginning of the long vacation in 1907, the two men, with Sushil's sons Sudhir and Ajit, were making for Qatar, about 25 miles beyond Simla. The long vacation stretched before them, and they thankfully left behind the heat of the plains. Qatar lies just off the Hindustan-Tibet road, where it passes through a massive pine forest. In a clearing there was a church, a school, a hospital, a handful of houses, orchards and fields of corn, and that was Qatar. It was a welcome contrast to the bustling activity of Delhi. Here in Qatar, Sushil Rudra and Charles Andrews first met Sundar Singh. Their common faith was an immediate bond. Although the solitary figure in his saffron robe was shy at first, a firm and lasting friendship took root. Sundar Singh's life and ministry as a sadhu found an enthusiastic response in the two men from Delhi. Sushil was a second-generation Christian. His father, Pyare Mohan Rudra, had, after becoming a Christian, determined to remain loyal to the Hindu tradition except where that tradition was clearly in conflict with Christian precepts. He was therefore regarded with suspicion by Hindu and Christians alike. Sushil had followed the same lonely path and knew its humiliations. When he met Sundar, he could, from his own experience, readily understand the sacrifices this young man had made. To them both, the future direction of the Indian church was a matter of passionate concern. Sundar was overjoyed to find, as a friend, another Indian, who saw as distinctly as he did the need for the Christian church in India to evolve its own identity. Charles F. Andrews, despite his own European background, shared Sushil's views, and he too was deeply influenced by Sundar Singh's outlook. In later years, when there was, amongst expatriate clergy, much opposition to the growing national movement in India, Andrews spoke and wrote strongly in support of Gandhi, and outspokenly criticized the British administration and what he called the Western captivity of the Indian church. A highlight of their annual summer vacations at Qatar was their meeting with Sundar. Often they found him with a group of children that he brought up from Sabathu for a holiday, and they noticed his spontaneous rapport with children. Susil's own children, Sudhir and Ajit, were devoted to him and would eagerly greet him and ply him with questions the moment they met. Charles Andrews recalled one occasion when they were at Qatar. Sundar got up one night from prayer and was preparing to go out alone. When questioned why he was starting so late at night, he replied that he had heard the call of someone from the valley below who was needing his immediate help. Those who were sleeping by his side implored him to wait until the early dawn and not to risk the dangers of the forest throughout the night. But the sadhu insisted on starting at that very moment. After a few days, he returned. The person he had gone to seek had been seriously ill and had greatly needed his assistance. Susil, Rudra, and Charles Andrews urged Sundar to visit them at the college at Delhi, and this he often did. They had another reason for encouraging his visits apart from the pleasure and inspiration of his company. They were at this time concerned about the quality of college life. If a boy from a Christian home could pass his matriculation exam, and the standard required was not particularly high, he could easily qualify for a place. The college was well endowed, and it was this easy availability of resources which paradoxically presented a problem. With so much provided, the students tended to see themselves as a privileged elite. From among these boys would come the future leaders in church and state. Their school career should have prepared them for the demands and disciplines of public life. Instead, they came to expect status and reward as their due. That this should be the case in a Christian college was a cause of great regret to Principal Rudra and Charles Andrews. The latter admitted with candor that his own lifestyle as a teacher was hardly likely to impress students as an example of austerity and self-denial. Yet Sundar Singh, on his visits, though himself a little older than the students, set before them an ideal of Christianity in his Indian context. Whenever he stayed with Susil, he spent hours talking with the students, and his influence upon them for good was immense. One gave up his prospect of lucrative government service to work as a Christian teacher. Another nursed one of the college servants, a man of the lowest caste, through an illness, unprecedented behavior. The third carried a peasant suffering from an infectious disease several miles over a rough mountain track to get him to a doctor. The friendship of the three men continued throughout their lives. When Andrews left Delhi for Bengal, he rarely met Sundar, although their friendship continued firm. But Susil, until his death in 1924, remained in touch with him. Saffron Singh was another young man who came under Sundar's influence at this time and was later to become a YMCA secretary in London. He recalls an incident from those times when they were staying together. Late one evening they noticed lights moving in the valley. Sundar thought that a leopard hunt was in progress. In the early hours of the morning, Saffron Singh was disturbed by a noise in the room and saw Sundar get up and go out. Saffron was not surprised, for he knew that the sadhu often kept a prayer vigil during the night. On this occasion, however, Saffron felt apprehensive. From a window he saw Sundar standing near some trees in the moonlight. Even as he watched, he saw a long, low, slinking shadow move silently towards Sundar. It was a leopard. Panic seized Saffron. He could neither move nor speak. He watched transfixed as Sundar turned absent-mindedly towards the animal and patted its head, as though it was a dog. Sundar seemed to have a strange power over animals. There is no record of his ever having been harmed by one, despite many perilous encounters. In similar vein is his experience at Thoria. Here he was forced to spend the night in a jungle cave, so hostile were the people. He awoke to find a leopard lying at his side. Without disturbing the sleeping animal, Sundar crept out of the cave unharmed. On leaving another unwelcoming village, Sundar climbed onto a rock to rest. He saw that he was being watched by a black panther. "What shall I do?" thought Sundar. "If I move, the panther may pounce. Yet I can't stay here forever." He prayed for God's guidance and protection, and then got down from the rock and walked with such confidence as he could muster back to the village and away from the panther. The villagers were curious. "Why have you come back here again? We thought we'd seen the last of you." Sundar described his miraculous escape, and as his story unfolded, so their attentiveness increased. One who had been spared from that same panther which had already killed several local men must be possessed of extraordinary holiness. Stories such as these spread from village to village. Tibet was accessible for only a few months in the year, so a large proportion of Sundar's year was spent wandering in northeast India, where he went from one village to another, seeking an audience. At Narkanda, midway between Simla and Qatar, Sundar stopped to talk to reapers working in the fields. Anxious to complete their harvest while the good weather held, they had no time to listen to preachers. Indignation rose when they discovered Sundar was a Christian. One of them hurled a stone at him and cut his head. The others looked up, expecting a torrent of curses and abuse, but they heard instead his gentle voice, murmuring, "Father, forgive them." He washed his injured head in the stream. The man who had cast the stone began to complain of a headache, and eventually had to give up reaping and go home. Quietly, Sundar took up that man's scythe and joined them in their work. All that day in the hot sun he labored with them. Gratitude overcame their resistance, and they asked him to come home with them and rest. That night at the house of a man called Nandi, brother to the one who had attacked him, Sundar talked to an eager audience about his Christian faith. The next day he bade them goodbye, but his message was not forgotten, and they wished they could hear more. They were further disconcerted on discovering that the part of the field which Sundar had reaped had produced a greater yield than ever before. Nandi was still full of the story when he met a friend some weeks later. He told Jia Ram what had occurred, and how they wished to meet Sundar Singh again. Jia was impressed. He had already heard tales of Sundar Singh and his compelling sanctity, and he decided to write to the Nur Afshan, a northern Indian newspaper, and through its columns appeal to Sundar to return to Narkonda. There is no record whether Sundar ever saw the newspaper, but it is most likely he did return to Narkonda, as it lay close by a road he often traveled. On another road of the region, Sundar noticed two men hurrying ahead of him. He lost sight of them as they rounded a bend, and when the road straightened again, only one was to be seen. He pointed with wild gesticulations towards a figure lying beneath a sheet on the ground. Sundar was somewhat surprised at the suddenness of this demise, but agreed to give the distraught survivor all the money he had on him for the burial expenses. There was nothing else he could do to help, so Sundar continued along the road. The sound of pounding footsteps behind him made him turn around. There stood the dead man's friend, weeping even more profusely. "He really is dead," he sobbed. "Yes, you told me before that he was dead," said Sundar gently, feeling somewhat puzzled. "It was a trick. We often did it. One of us would pretend to be dead, and the other would persuade passers-by to part with burial money. We would take it in turns to play the part of the dead man. When you left, I lifted the sheet, and I found he really had died. I should never have deceived a holy man like you." He wiped his tears and added, "Thank goodness it was not my turn to be the dead man." Sundar comforted him and explained he was a Christian sadhu. When he told him that God would forgive him and his friend, the man was keen to hear more. At the end of their discussion, he asked Sundar if he would baptize him. This is something Sundar would not do. He explained that it would be better if the man went to a mission station at Garhwal, which is not far away. There he would receive further teaching and could become part of a local worshipping community. The fame of Sundar spread throughout the region as the stories multiplied. Sundar, however, had no desire for his own name to become famous. It was the name of Jesus Christ alone which mattered. God had given to Sundar a rare and precious gift, the ability to communicate powerfully to others the faith which had transformed his life. Friends, while acknowledging his innate ability, considered nonetheless that his ministry would profit from some formal evangelistic training. The Bishop of Lahore, Dr. Lefroy, had watched Sundar's career with growing appreciation. The bishop wanted to put before Sundar the possibility of ordination, for he felt that within the ordained ministry his contribution to the Indian church would be invaluable. It was with this in mind that in 1909, when Sundar was in his 20th year, the bishop suggested that he should attend St. John's Divinity School, Lahore.